There is a lot of terminology in model railroading that might be confusing to someone who's just getting started in the hobby or even someone that's trying to advance in the hobby. And we're going to go over some of that terminology today on Coffee and Trains. Welcome everybody to another edition of Coffee and Trains. Before we begin, I'm drinking Varus Brothers Highlander Grog, and as always, black with 2 sugars. So today I wanted to go over some of the terminology that was, when I first started out, was a little bit confusing to me, and it took me a little bit while to learn. And what I want to do is basically make kind of a database reference that beginners can come and look at, and they can get an idea for what different terminology means when you hear it. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, before we begin, I'm not going to go over specific scales in this video. I've actually done a video like that, and I'll link that right up here as well as in the description below. So let's go ahead and talk about the first one, which is DC versus DCC. DC is the original way that model trains have been ran. It stands for direct current, just like anywhere else in the electrical world. And basically what it does is it varies the voltage that goes to the track, and that's what changes the speed and the direction of the trains on the track. And it can be a little bit more complicated to wire if you're looking to do complex operations such as multiple trains and things like that. It's very simple to start off with. You literally just connect wires to the track and it runs the train. But as you get into more complex multiple locomotive operations, the wiring can get quite complex. Now, DCC stands for Digital Command and Control. And what it basically does is it supplies a constant amount of power to the track, and it also sends a digital signal through the track to the trains, and the trains have what are called DCC decoders in them, and they can read their signal. Now, the benefit of this is that you can run multiple locomotives on the same track and control them individually, which means that wiring is less complicated with DCC than it is with DC. And some of the drawbacks, though, the biggest drawback is, though, it is more costly than DC. So if you're looking at it, DCC is probably the one where you want to end up. But if you're looking to start off and you're on a really tight budget, go ahead and take a look at DC. All right, so let's get into some fun track terminology. Now, you may have been looking around after buying your starter set or looking to buy a starter set, and you may be seeing all this track. It's like, it has a code, and it's like, what? You'll see code 100, code 83, code 80, code 55, code 70, and you're just looking at it like, what does that even mean? I don't understand. Is there some sort of code that I have to have that's specific to power packs, to trains, that kind of stuff? Codes are simply the measurement of the height of the rail. And basically, for an example, code 100, which is an HO scale code typically, is 1/10 of an inch. And that's typically the size you're going to get in your HO scale starter sets. You also have code 83 and code 70 in HO scale, which are more prototypical heights. And that's what you're seeing. So code 83 is 0.083 inches tall, and code 70 is 0.070 inches tall. And for in scale, code 80 is typically going to be the one you see in starter sets, or like what I would run with Kato Unitrack. So that's 0.080 inches tall. And code 55 is going to be the more prototypical looking one. So that's going to be 0.055 inches tall. So that's what those codes mean. It's just the rail height. It's nothing crazy complicated. Continuing on with track, you may see the words gauge and scale used a lot. And they do mean something slightly different, even though sometimes people then use them interchangeably. Scale is basically the size in proportion to a real-world prototype. So this does not have anything to do with the track itself, even though it'll reference a certain type of track. This is what it means. And when we're going to gauge is literally the width between the rails. So that's the distance between the rails. So you have in gauge, HO gauge, O gauge, G gauge, things like that. And then you have in scale, HO scale, O scale, G scale, things like that. And what this means is basically you can have a different scale running on a different gauge. A great example of this is O scale's narrow gauge is called ON30. So it's an O scale, but it runs on an HO gauge track. So there's a lot of different variations like this. Another great example is British OO scale that runs on HO gauge track, even though it's slightly larger than American HO scale. So that's the difference between gauge and scale. I need coffee. Sticking with track and moving into one of the most complex pieces of track, which are switches, is what you probably heard them before you got into mono railroading. But now you're probably hearing a lot of them. They're called turnouts. Turnouts are switches. It's just the proper name for them. So when you hear someone say a turnout, that's a switch. So that's what that is. Now, if you're looking at typically your starter sets or what the most common way to power a switch, if you choose to power it, you can also just throw them manually. There's what's called a snap relay. And what this basically is a momentary power twin coil solenoid that when powered snaps one way or direction. It makes a snapping motion, and that's why it's called a snap switch. You're going to see this a lot in Atlas is the most ubiquitous one. You also have Bachmann that uses it in their Easy Track. So things like that, those are called snap relays or snap switches. Now, when you're getting into the more prototypical stuff, you're going to want to throw the turnouts slower. And what you're doing with that is you're basically going to use a slow motion motor. The most common one that a lot of people know is a tortoise switch motor. See, they call it a switch, even though it's a turnout. So those basically use either servos or stepper motors to slowly turn and throw a switch or a turnout. So that is basically what switches and turnouts and how they're thrown are. Sticking with turnouts, you may see numbered turnouts, and you're like, what does that even mean? What is a number 4 turnout? What is a number 5 turnout? What's a number 7 turnout? What's a number 10 turnout? Basically, this is a measurement of the divergence it runs from track. So think of it this way. If it is a number 4 turnout, and we're going to use inches, for every 4 inches that the track travels, the turnout is going to diverge 1 inch. So if you have a number 5, it's going to go for every 5 inches it diverges 1 inch. For a number 10, for every 10 inches it diverges 1 inch. So the lower the number, the quicker the divergence happens. So it just really depends on building your yard. The larger locomotives are going to have a tougher time handling the smaller turnouts versus larger turnouts. Most of them are going to be fine, especially when you're looking at diesels, but if you're looking at steam, you may have to take special consideration into your divergence of your turnouts. Last thing on track is radii. You just have to pay attention to your track radius, especially when you're looking at set track. When you have flex track, you can kind of set your own radius, but you need to really pay attention to your track radii, especially when you're purchasing or if you already have locomotives in certain rolling stock, because certain locomotives in rolling stock can only handle a certain minimum radii. So especially with steam locomotives, they typically can't handle as tight of a track radius as the diesels can, and even larger diesels can't handle as tight of a track radius as your smaller diesels can. So one thing you just need to pay attention to is a track radii, which is simply just how tight the turns are. Moving on into what runs on the track, the first thing you'll know is that what is a train. Now we're going to get into that. So a train is actually everything put together. So what are the parts of a train? The first one is going to be what you probably know as the engine. This is also known as the locomotive or the power. You can also hear it called the motive power as well. So that's what an engine is called, whether it's steam or diesel. It is the power or the locomotive or the engine. That's what it's going to be. Cars, the term you're going to hear as you get into more is rolling stock. Now this can be literally anything that's on the rails. It's called rolling stock. So you may hear people say, what kind of rolling stock do you have? That kind of stuff. That's what they're referring to is what kind of cars that you have. And last but not least, you're going to hear what is a consist. A consist is where you have 2 or more locomotives connected together, usually by their couplers, and they are working together to haul a train. You see this a lot actually in the real world with mainline diesel locomotives pulling big trains. You're going to see 2 or 3 of them stacked together. Those are consisted. So consisting is just the act of connecting several locomotives together to be able to haul a large train. Speaking of trains, let's talk about some train types that you might hear. The first one I'm going to talk about is pretty obvious. Passenger trains, they have passenger cars. And there are different types of passenger trains, but Passenger trains run passenger cars. Next one I'm going to talk about is your freight trains. The first one I'm going to talk about is a manifest freight, which is typically a mixed freight train. So it just has a bunch of different cars in it. And that's the most common one you're going to see a lot on a railroad. You also have what are called unit trains. Unit trains are typically a lot of the same thing. So it may be a lot of tank cars hauling oil. It may be a lot of hopper cars hauling coal. It's going to be all the same thing. And then the last main one you're going to see is what's called an intermodal train. And these are the ones where you see the containers stacked in the well cars and you see them running around. So those are the train types that you are going to see the most of. Last thing I'm going to talk about is grades, which is something that people can get pretty confused on. Grades are simply rise over run and put into a percentage. So let's give an example of you need to increase your height by 1 inch over 100 inches of track. That's going to be a 1% grade because it's 1 over 100. And that is 1%. Now, typically a good maximum to use on a model railroad, even though it's not that prototypical, if there were a lot of these grades, it'd be a lot tougher. But a 2% grade is typically the max you want to go and still maintain a prototypical look and feel. You can obviously do a lot more. There are train sets that are built that have a lot more, but 2% is typically a good number that I say is something that still looks prototypical but can get you some good elevation change in a relatively short amount of time. So that is some of the basic terminology that you might hear when you're getting into model railroading, and it might be a little bit confusing. I hope this helps. And what I want to do is, if you are a more advanced model railroader and you've heard some terminology that I did not mention, I would like you to put that in the comments. I want this to be kind of an open source repository for people to have the different terminology explained to them. So go ahead and leave any other terminologies that you may have found confusing in the past before in the comments below. So thank you guys so much for watching. Let's get into some of the coffees that you guys are drinking. Wyke D Insanity says that he's drinking Maxwell House 100% Colombian. Darren James says he's drinking Kicking Horse Coffee 454 Horsepower Bold and Black. Says it keeps me going through the day so I can get back to the hobby desk. That is the definition of what coffee is for. Kent S says he's drinking Tim Hortons Original. Oakley Skidmore says he's drinking Maine 105 blend with cream and sugar. And Mickey's #1 fan says that he's drinking whatever K-cup he happens to grab at the moment. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to tell me which coffees you are drinking. I add it to my list of coffees to try. And I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons. They're listed right here. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month. There's a lot of stuff that goes on there, a lot of behind the scenes, a lot of exclusive access to things. So thank you guys so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, drink some coffee, and happy railroading.